Across the different transaction types that we've talked about, mergers, acquisitions, asset transfers, et cetera, Michealle, how do you approach valuing a nonprofit organization or its assets? Do the traditional metrics apply, when there's no shareholders? So, thinking about things in addition to beyond the financials, you mentioned reputation, thinking about mission and the role the organization's playing in the community, so how do you think about all of these in terms of kind of valuing the nonprofit?
That is such a tricky question, Michelle.
I'm sorry?
That's okay. No, it's a good question to be asking because depending on what you're doing, valuation can be really, really important. So I'm on the board at Wellspring where Julie is currently serving. Last year, we had a program, an employee assistance program that we ended up selling to a third party for profit company. And so valuation was a huge part of this conversation. And ultimately, in that particular case, we use a multiple of revenue to value this particular piece of our entity, which is a typical way to value that type of a business. The biggest question is what multiple of revenue do you use? So you look at your annual revenue and multiply it by a certain number, and that's your valuation. That multiple can be wildly different depending on the type of business you're talking about. Sometimes it's a fraction, it's like 75%, and sometimes it can be multiple years worth of revenue. I think in our case, it ended up being like 3 years worth of revenue, but that is a common valuation methodology. Often also you will look at assets and the value of those assets. Remember that when you're looking at financial statements, typically your assets are valued at historical cost. So if you think about land or a building that you own, it's probably on your books at the original purchase price minus the depreciation. So the dollar amount that is on your financial statements is probably far lower than the actual fair value of that piece of property. So you might need to bring in experts to help with the valuation. When we're thinking about real estate, oftentimes a real estate broker can give you at least a quick estimate and you don't necessarily have to go through a full valuation process. Another common area of assets in the nonprofit world is investments because of reserves and endowment funds and things like that. Many times those are invested in the types of investments that you can look up online and have a pretty good understanding of the value. But sometimes nonprofits do own pieces of private companies or other things that are much more difficult to value. And again, you would probably need to bring in valuation expertise, which many CPA firms and law firms can help out. And it's really just looking at the specifics of that asset, figuring out what it might be worth. Oftentimes, though, when we're talking about mergers or consolidations, consideration is not exchanged. And so the valuation of your assets or your revenue streams really is irrelevant to the conversation. Because if you're combining two nonprofits, oftentimes it's something like an asset transfer, something like that, where it's all getting moved over. Ultimately, what the value of those is less important.
Jacob, we're going to shift gears a little bit from some of the money chat and talk about the legal requirements for nonprofit mergers and acquisitions. How might these differ from that in the for-profit world?
Yeah. And the cool thing is they don't differ that much, which is really interesting. With any merger, consolidation, or legal combination, I'll call it, though this is separate from the unofficial stuff that goes on by contract. The legal stuff, you're always going to have to file articles of merger consolidation, which is exactly what you'd have to do with a for-profit. Now that's the last step. So let's work our way back. You're always going to have a definitive agreement that explains out how this all works, whether it be a consolidation, an asset transfer, or a merger. We call that sort of the plan of merger sometimes. That's a little bit more of a summary of the document, but altogether it kind of equals the plan. The main thing is you need the boards to approve it. You need both boards to approve a merger. You need both boards to approve a consolidation, and you probably need both boards to approve an asset transfer. Sometimes if the acquiring organization and asset transfer is so much bigger than the smaller organization, that bigger organization doesn't need to approve that. They're just going to accept the funds. But certainly the person that's giving all their assets, their board. Now the big difference is In a for-profit, you're going to have shareholder approval as well for these mergers and transactions. A shareholder is always going to approve that happens. In a nonprofit context, we don't have shareholders. There's no owners. However, if a nonprofit does have members, statutory members that have rights to vote in the organization, oftentimes they'll have a right to vote on a merger as well, or any other transaction of the type. They will need to give their approval based on board recommendation to have this happen. So that's the key steps to like a merger on the organization's end. Oftentimes you might need a regulatory approval as well. Surprisingly enough, the Attorney General requires notice and their approval for asset transfers. They don't require them for C3 to C3 mergers, but they do require for like C4 to C3 mergers or something like that.
And that's here in Washington?
You're in Washington only. Obviously, everyone's going to have to look at their own jurisdiction for what their Attorney General or their Secretary of State needs to approve. But you also want to make sure you're keeping track of all the regulatory requirements as well. I just had one where we needed to get the Attorney General's antitrust division to approve because it was 2 health organizations, and there's a new law in the books that says because of antitrust rules, we need to make sure that we approve it so that we're not violating antitrust rules, which we did, and it was fine. But that's also something that a lot of people don't understand, that nonprofits are beholden to all state and federal antitrust rules. And they need to make sure those are not violated. No one's ever going to get to the probably level of the federal antitrust levels, but state antitrust levels are still there.
So this, raises a lot of questions or need to understand among board members their fiduciary responsibilities. And this is an issue I've run in with board members in all kinds of contexts, them actually understanding that they're fiduciaries and they have fiduciary responsibilities. So how do these fiduciary duties apply when considering a merger or, on the other end, a dissolution? What protections might board members need in this process?
And I think I should tackle that one first. So the same fiduciary duties that they've always had on a board apply. And those are the 3 main ones: duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience. Duty of care means that they're going to approach this transaction, whether it be a combination or a dissolution, as as a prudent person would. We're going to ask questions. They're going to review all the documents that are necessary to affect this transaction. They're going to, seek to understand the implications of this transaction, including the finances. The duty of loyalty, they're going to act in the best interest of the organization. Question: in a merger or in a dissolution, how is that in the best interest of the organization when it's going away? Well, it certainly is in its best interest to make sure that you give sort of a merciful death and an agonizing one, right? Is kind of the idea. Like, let's not bleed this out. Let's make sure we're kind of cutting this clean so that our people can be paid, our liabilities can be paid, and there's not a lawsuit later on. So that's one thing you have to think about. And then same with a merger. And that's why I think about we need a culture where we celebrate mergers. As this is actually great for the organization. It makes us bigger, makes us stronger, and it's just a new phase of life at the end of the day. And then the duty of obedience. Make sure, again, you're following those requirements that I mentioned. Make sure you're following your bylaws as the bylaws say such things happen, if the bylaws speak to it at all, and your articles of incorporation. But as you do that, then you're sort of protecting yourself by following those duties. And the normal protections that already apply, the law covers for when it has a limitation of liability for violations of duty of care. Again, just negligence, not misconduct. You have indemnification obligations as the organization that can cover you, and the future organization that's taking over for you would take over those indemnification obligations. So again, you're sort of not operating business as usual when it comes to your fiduciary duties. It's just the stakes are a bit higher because this is very pertinent what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Julie, what's your experience been with working with boards and their understanding of their roles through the decision process, implementation, et cetera?
Yeah, I think it's challenging because board members don't typically join a board to be involved in an organization that's having challenges. Board members join a board because they want to do good and they want to be part of like the goodness, for the most part. And so I think there's a lot of work around educating board members of what the fiduciary duties really mean in practice, and not just reading it on a piece of paper. Like, what does that look like? How do we behave according to that? And I think the other thing is when there are, So if we're talking, because most of my experience, frankly, has been more with boards that are like in a moment of like kind of big challenges and transitions, it's scary. I think also having some empathy for the board members of like, this is not what I've also heard, I've heard a lot of this. This is not what I signed up for. Yeah. Yeah. And not in a flippant way, like just in a really like heartfelt, like this is not what I signed up for. And I'm really worried about like, how do we make good decisions? So I think for me, it's a lot of education and empathy for board members of like, what are all the ways that mergers and acquisitions and all the little iterations of that can look, and what does it mean for our community versus just the ego and the sort of history of our name or our organization, and then really grounding us in like, where is the mission, like how are we stewarding this mission forward?
Thank you. So let's talk about the process, some kind of practical guidance for organizations as they are considering these options. Julie, I'll look to you to kind of take the lead
Yeah.
in this next conversation, but Jacob and Michaela, please jump in. So if an executive director of a nonprofit is listening right now and thinking, oh, hey, this might be us, what should their first steps be?
Yeah, so for me, I think the first step is talking to whoever your 2, 3 kind of biggest supporters on your board are. So I would call them my all-star board members, and to say like, hey, this is what I'm thinking. Am I missing something? I'm seeing this. Do you see it too? And starting there to kind of get support of like, is this a possibility that you're also seeing? And starting with bringing board leadership along. And so there's some work there. I think then step 2 is going and having a lot of conversations. And for me, it is not saying, well, I listened to Jacob talk about the 7 different ways you could partner. And do you want to do a joint venture or a merger or da 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 da? Instead of the way that I approach it is to say like, hey, so we are in this state of whatever it is, like showing some vulnerability, transition, and vulnerability and openness with another CEO or executive director, and saying one-on-one, face-to-face, this is what we're going through. We're looking for support. We're looking for a partner, for a buddy. I don't know what's going to look like. Do you know who you'd recommend I talk to? And so I'm not going and saying, do you want to buddy up with us? It is like, who should, and then this has been for me such a great process, because then people say like, oh my gosh, again, Jane, who has the 3 kids, boy, she really went through this with another organization and her board really came together. Go talk to her. And John over at this organization has so many good experiences. Go talk to him. And this other person, I hear that they might be looking for someone. You should go talk to them. And then you'll have a whole bunch of like really conversations that go nowhere. And then 1 or 2 that pop up with something really useful.
When do you start to bring in staff into these conversations? Because rumors, all about, and the panic that it's.
I mean, I find this to be such a difficult thing. This is definitely the question that I've always hated all my life, is it depends would be my answer. I think it depends on the staff. I think it depends on the situation. I think it depends on where you are in the process. I think bringing in, especially staff leadership, is critical at some point. I think that if it's a situation where you're really looking to do some kind of merger, like really it's sort of you gotta have staff buy-in. I think if you have an organization where you have a strong leader is depending upon their strong leaders, their strong staff leadership to bring out good ideas. And that strong staff leadership is depending upon their teams to bring out good ideas. And so ideally, that's how it's going. I don't think that's a very good answer, though.
I think that that's fair. It really does depend on the kind of facts and circumstances. What I struggle
think it's
with,
a good answer too. And I'll add one more thing.
Yeah.
Without people, you don't have an organization. So if you don't bring the people that make up your organization along on the process, your transaction, whatever it ends up looking like, is not going to work, right? So if people get scared and think they're going to lose their job, the talented ones in particular will exit your organization quickly. If they think their job is at risk and they think there's a risk they're not going to get a paycheck, they will go find somebody else who they believe will give them a consistent paycheck. So I think there's a really thoughtful process to bring people along. And I think, like Julie said, you need to start with your higher level leadership within your organization and then kind of work your way through the organization. But if the rumor mill starts and fear crops up within the organization, it will work against you.
And what I'll add to that is a question like that really depends on. We've been talking a lot about the culture of like each organization. This also depends on the culture of the transaction. Is it going to be a collaborative transaction? Is it going to be a real acquiring transaction? They look very different. But if you're in a collaborative situation, usually I have this, like, it usually doesn't make its way into the agreement so much, but I say, have your separate task force where all the, you're meeting every week. Talk constantly about, hey, who are we bringing in now to this conversation? What level of staff can know about this now? What is the plan for them? So it's a constant conversation that by the time we actually get to staff announcement, really everyone already knows what's going on, at least unofficially, right? And this is the moment that we know exactly what the plan is for the transition to occur. But yeah, as long as you have that, again, that collaborative working, then the other side is also not hamstringing your organization about what it knows. You're not hamstringing its organization about what it knows. It's rather sort of a progressive process.
So, related to that, I've heard things, statements like, oh, we can't tell staff because if we tell staff, all going to leave because they're just going to know that things are going to be hard or they're all going to leave, or there are always these reasons for not telling staff. And this is, one of the things that can be really disruptive to what is intended to happen in the end.
Yeah. Julie has so much to say here.
Body's like jumping. I mean, that's a whole conversation around just leadership generally. And I think typically, not always, but I think typically the worst possible scenario is to wake up on Monday and say, like, surprise, everybody, you have new leadership and toodles. Like that's not healthy. And so I think the key is, how do you bring people along in the right way at the right time, in a way that honors their own stress levels and anxieties and insecurity around money. Like, we live in such an expensive time and such an expensive place. Like, that's real. It really is real. And so I think taking that into account in a really empathetic way, it's a whole thing around change management.
To play devil's advocate for a minute, it's risky. There are situations, again, when you talk about the culture of the transaction, where you are going to have an acquired situation. You see this a lot with asset transfers, right? Where the other organization that's taking on is actually pretty upfront and saying, we actually aren't taking on any of your employees. They're not going to have jobs at the end of this unless you pay them separately, right? And you can still take care of your employees in that way, right? You can still have a transaction that says, we're going to transfer you these assets, but can you help us take care of our employees? In some ways there's a consideration, or in some ways, do you have what it takes to make sure your employees are well taken care of in a severance or some sort of exit package that says, thank you for getting us here. The organization take the torch at this point,
I also just think it's important to acknowledge fear-based decisions are usually bad ones.
Yes, they are.
As you're debating your options, you're going to have multiple options and none of them are going to be perfect. That's life. Think about your own feelings and where that is leading you. And if it's really a fear-based thing that's leading you in a certain direction, acknowledge that. Recognize it for what it is, and then try and set that particular emotion aside. I also believe that fear is bred in darkness. So if you can shine that light and bring people in, let them know what you do know, and acknowledge that you don't know everything, it can calm a lot of fear. And you don't need to tell more than is necessary. But I think acknowledging we are considering multiple options. We don't know where we're going to go for sure yet. Even just having a simple conversation like that can make a really big difference.
Absolutely. kind of thinking about this process of bringing people along. Jacob, earlier you mentioned kind of from a transactional perspective, this timeline can be, 6-ish months or longer, depending on how complex it is. But how do we think about, what organizations should expect from a timeline that is inclusive of, but not limited to, just kind of that transactional part of it, the contracts, the reviewing of documents, and et cetera. What are some of the critical milestones and potential roadblocks organizations should be thinking about, setting, preparing for? Does the intended structure affect that timeline? And so this, in many ways, I'm kind of getting at that kind of people dimension of this. Julie?
I for sure thought you were going to Jacob on this one because
I was going to pass it to you though, because I can only do the legal end.
this is I think for me, this is my hilarious answer, in a little bit of a delusional sort of way, is asset transfer and then dissolution that I worked with Jacob on is it was 10 weeks. Did you know that, Jacob? 10 weeks from start to finish.
Really?
It felt like 100 years.
Yeah,
No,
I
I'm
did. That's surprising.
10 weeks over the holidays, over the end of the year.
Ooh,
Bonkers
rough.
bananas. I would never do that again.
That included all the outside negotiations that we did and all that.
Everything. Yeah. It was like Thanksgiving to January 31st. Yeah. So that was, I would never recommend that. You, Michealle, on the other hand, you described an 8-year timeline, right? For the organization you just talked about in your introduction. So I think somewhere in between 10 weeks and 8 years would be my recommendation.
Really exact.
Yeah. I will say also that, but I think there's a lot of, like, when we talked about like going and having the conversations and like, hey, do you guys think there's a problem? Because I think there's a problem. Like, that is a much longer period. And then the like, hey, we could be friends, right? We could work together. That sort of dating period is a much longer period. And then I think you get to the like, hey, we should put a contract in place. And I think now you get to some sort of like finite thing that sounds, months is probably 6 months-ish, Jacob.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're talking about the actual transaction, you're talking about 6 months to a year, where you're like, you're talking about getting up to a letter of intent that explains what will this agreement look like, and then you're getting to the agreement and all of its approvals, and then you're getting to the closing. I think that's, I'd say like 6 months to a year for your average decently sized transaction.
I think that timeline is an area that's not dissimilar to for-profit entities. There's just a certain amount of time it takes to put together a transaction.
And then that dating process that Julie was talking about.
There's also the honeymoon process on the other end. There is a lot of integration that goes on after, pen is put to paper, after handshakes are done for the closing and all that. There is still a massive amount of people getting used to each other and figuring out what that looks like. And does that work out? And sometimes the agreement includes a honeymoon period to say, hey, what if it doesn't work out after a year or two? What do we do then? I've certainly had clients come back and say, hey, boy, I don't know about that, because the minute we shook hands, personalities changed and stuff. So you have to be prepared for that honeymoon period.
And so let's talk about that dating period just a little bit more. Julie, you talked about kind of that friendly chat with that colleague, executive director. But what does that process look like in terms of, organization A says, we know where we're at right now. We're looking at the horizon. We understand our current environment. We don't see things changing. And we really do believe that for the benefit of our community, there are 3 organizations in town that do very similar things. Maybe it's time there's only 2 organizations in town. So let's figure out how we're going to merge or do something to there's not enough money out there to go across the 3 organizations in town that do a lot of the same things. So how do we figure this out? How do you go about that process? Do you need help with that? Are there roles for lawyers and accountants or state associations or whoever else?
I mean, first of all, I'm going to tell you one of my favorite professions in the world is lawyers. I know lawyers get a lot of like bad rap.
Thanks, Julie.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. So I cannot emphasize enough the importance of going and finding someone who understands specifically nonprofit law. I think
Mhm.
that's really essential. Just because there's just a lot of stuff I don't know, and like we just don't know because we that's not what we do.
Mhm.
And the really important things to find out and questions that you're like, oh shoot, I need to go figure that out before we can move forward. So I think in terms of people to involve, I think that's really important. I have not worked with a consultant on mergers and acquisitions mainly because I had hoped to, but I couldn't. The ones that I've been a part of hadn't had the money to do so, and
Mhm.
been able to look around to find sort of that informal assistance. So colleague expertise, if you will.
Mhm.
And then the other piece I think is just in terms of the process is getting an NDA in place and just starting to look more. It's not due diligence. It is just sort of the like fun diligence. Just going through and looking at contracts and things where we can sort of say like, yeah, we can sort of see how this would work, where the real benefits are for either organization. The other thing I would say, Michelle, is when you talk about like, well, there are 3 people in town that do what we do. I think broadening I think this is something I found too, and also why getting leadership involved is really important, is because I don't think there's actually anybody in town that does exactly the same thing. And so broadening your scope to say like, hey, who do we admire? Who do we see that's doing really cool stuff that maybe isn't doing what we do, but are adjacent to us? I think
Mhm.
that's where I've really found a lot of momentum is organizations that do all of this. And then this organization complements it,
Mhm.
complements their work. So that's,
I think that's a great.
I'm just thinking about what Julie said in finding complementary organizations. In the for
Mhm.
profit world, we think about not just expanding our current scope of services, but we think about like vertical integrations, like
Mhm.
emerging in somebody that's in our supply chain, right?
Mhm.
That exact conversation is typically not relevant for a nonprofit. But if you think about the continuum of services, often somebody who needs your services also needs other services.
Mhm.
So if you could
Mhm.
think about kind of stacking those services in a way that really makes the most sense for the community you're trying to serve, I think that's just another way of thinking about not just who does the same thing we do or very similar things, but how do we make a better service for our community
Mm.
by combining.
Perfect. Go ahead, Jacob.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think that's key. Exactly what they're saying. I think you get a lot of nonprofits that want to do very specific things, which is great to begin with. I want to help a specific subset of people between Fourth and Fifth Street or something like that, right?
Mhm.
To start
Mhm.
out with, at some point that's going to be accomplished, right? So, how does that maybe fit into the pattern of what another organization might do?
So we've talked a little bit about the internal communication, boards, staff, etc. How do you start to think about outside kind of stakeholder communication with funders and the community? What's the right approach and timing for that? The need to balance transparency with sensitive negotiations, etc.
this is another consultant I would hire. Besides lawyers, communication specialists. Yes.
Yes. I second the hiring the communications specialist. And there are communications firms that specialize in types of communication. And this is one of those types of communication that you can find people who really specialize in it.
Any other thoughts, Jacob?
Well, don't violate NDAs
Yeah.
when you're communicating.
There it is. All right, Jacob, you mentioned sort of that honeymoon phase, that post merger or post whatever transaction, that integration, so Julie, talk through some of, and Jacob and Michaela, I'm sure you have your own stories and perspective to add, but talk through that kind of, the ink is dry on all of the agreements, and where are some of the places that organizations can stumble, and how can they think about that in advance and plan for it?
Can I just say culture, period? And then
The end. Yep.
I mean, I think that is the biggest to me, that's the biggest thing is when I say there are 3 organizations doing the same thing, but they don't do exactly the same thing. three organizations are doing the same thing in this city with very different approaches. And I think that is the hardest thing to tackle. And I personally am of the opinion like you're not going to have a match of cultures. It's just not going to happen. And so then addressing like where the mismatches are, I think is the biggest. It's really hard.
I think second to that is the work to actually implement your merger. So you have a beautiful document that Jacob and his colleagues have written up. It has a lot of great things in it. Now you have to do it. And
I do?
yeah, there are all kinds of reasons that you actually have to implement what your legal document says. So I had a client, this was several years ago now, two associations merged. They had very complementary things. All was great. They wrote it down on paper, legally done. And then they thought they were done. And then they hired my firm and we came in and said, okay, cool. So this document you guys executed says this. You haven't actually done that. So under the terms of their agreement, all of their memberships were supposed to transfer into one entity. And they weren't. And this particular case dealt with international organizations. So international taxes came into play and it got quite complicated from there. But often the idea of, okay, this is going to go over here. Okay, easy peasy, done. But making that happen across two different organizations with two separate systems. And, if you add in some international elements too, that just actually turns out really hard. And there were a whole lot of practical reasons why that didn't happen the way they intended it to. Banking can get tough, all kinds of things, but it's a lot of work to actually combine operations, combine systems, all of that kind of stuff. And it takes a lot of persistence.
Persistence and patience and secret crying phone calls to your lawyer.
Right. Exactly.
Guilty.
Exactly. Your therapist, everybody. Yes. If you need to cry, that's okay.
The post-merger phase on my end is always the part where I'm like, I think I cause more problems than anybody. Like the lawyer comes in, creates this great document. Okay, go HR department, go accounting department. They're like, why did you not even talk to us like before you?
Yeah.
So I was trying to get those people involved right away. The one thing I'll say though, and to take it even maybe in a little bit of a different thing, is when you talk about the lower tier transactions, we're talking about those affiliations that I was talking about, or those joint ventures. The post transaction behavior actually dictates like kind of in the future what it'll be. So I had a client where it was an affiliation, one became the sole member of the other organization, and they were going to be very separate. I mean, the agreement was very airtight about everyone being very separate and continuing on that. But eventually they learned that they actually couldn't help but integrate more. It just became that they couldn't actually follow the contract because they just naturally kept coming together, which actually brought them to a full merger and said, oh, okay, well, let's actually just consummate that.
Okay, nearing the end, folks. So at the beginning, we talked about the kind of current reality, funding issues, solvency issues, political changes, etc. Michaela, the federal funding environment, we're going to say it's been volatile. You mentioned states are facing budget deficits. Washington has a particularly significant one, but it's not the only state. How are you seeing organizations kind of respond to this? And what I'm asking is, are you seeing organizations make decisions prematurely? So they're moving too fast? Like they're reacting? Are you seeing them waiting too long? They just think this is going to pass. So where are you seeing things?
I don't think I've ever seen somebody act prematurely with these conversations. I would say it's almost always the latter. Julie and I have both been in part of conversations where people are like, but this isn't forever. And we're like, the current administration will be in place for 3 more years. We have a 3-year runway to weather this storm. And so people like to think, but it's going to get better. Tomorrow's a new day. It's not going to be like this forever. And they have a tendency to wait too long.
Jacob, Julie, similar experience?
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add to what Michaela just said. I think that's absolutely spot on.
The only other thing I would add is that I think it is, as a board member, you're coming in once a month, maybe once every other month, maybe once a quarter for a couple of hours. And so it is not the most pressing thing. And what's happening in this nonprofit is not the most pressing in your life. And so I think there is a lot of responsibility on the leadership of a nonprofit to really bring forward, like, hey, y'all, I need you to pay attention right now.
I've definitely seen that happen too, because in between board meetings, a lot can change.
Yes.
So the last board meeting, we might not have had a problem. But now on today, this board meeting, we might have a really big problem. And sometimes you'll hear from board members things like, but why didn't you tell us this sooner?
It just happened.
And you're like, well, today's that day because it just happened. I'm sorry that you feel that you were left in the dark, but here we are. And I think especially what we've seen over the past year with the federal funding, it was an overnight change. There was no notice, right? That was part of the problem.
Yeah.
So just also recognizing as a board member, it's not that you were left in the dark. It's that things change rapidly. And it's been a whole month since your last board meeting.
One of the things I'm seeing a lot and kind of along the lines related to this is this new push. And I am going to call it new because maybe it's just louder, particularly among foundations, but other funders who are really pushing for a consolidation in the sector, kind of a reduction in the number of organizations. Given what's happening at the federal level with the funding availability, that kind of makes sense, why this is happening. Do you guys see any other reasons for this particular push? Jacob, thoughts? This idea that there's just too many nonprofits.
So that would be my mantra. Is the most, as a nonprofit attorney saying that, I do say that. There's too many nonprofits in this world. I think I come at it from, and then perhaps this is where the foundations are getting it. I can't speak into their mind necessarily, but there's limited amount of funding in this world. It's finite, and not everyone can get a piece of that pie. And now foundations, if we're really thinking the best of them, they want to do the most good. So they want to make sure that that more people, more percentage of the nonprofit community is getting more of that pie, right? Than everyone just taking their 2 cents and going off. So that's one aspect of it. I think there's also this idea of what's more effective, right? Foundations, they're constantly also looking at, is our dollar going to where we want it to go, and is it being effective with that? And the idea probably being that the more consolidated the industry is, the bigger organizations are, the more effective they're going to be with each dollar given. And I think in some ways, I think that's personally true, and probably on average. That's not always true though, and foundations need to think about that. But I think that's kind of where it's coming from. And for maybe even those more grassroots focused foundations, the ones that actually want to see nonprofits make it and do well and not necessarily be burdened by the volatility of the current administration, they also probably understand that consolidation helps in terms of their power as well. A big organization standing up to a government agency is more effective than a lot of small organizations that can't really do much.
Julie, Michaela, anything to add? No? All right.
I'm with Jacob.
So yay, Jacob. We're going to go to you again, Jacob. Policy. So, we've talked about, regardless of kind of whatever transaction type you're taking, it can be complicated from a perspective of regulations and statutes and what you have to do, et cetera. So, as we're looking at the benefits of mergers and acquisitions, kind of this M&A concept across nonprofits, are there particular policy changes, Jacob, that you would point to as being necessary or at minimum would just make things easier for these transactions to happen?
So the biggest one that I can think of is actually perhaps not. I think state level contracting should really take into account mergers and acquisitions, and it doesn't. If you ever go through it, I talked about getting contracts transitioned over to other organizations as you merge. This is one aspect of it. The contract agency usually doesn't take into account an M&A when they're giving that contract out. They'll work with you to do it, but that's really not their point. It would be nice though, in policy wise, to say there actually is specific contingency here for this, and you don't need to constantly go back and forth with us over an extended period of time to actually make this work. In fact, the contract itself could encourage consolidation. I don't just mean a merger, I mean any sort of partnership. So that again, and we can even think this from a taxpayer standpoint, actually less taxpayer dollars are spent doing something. And the contract itself / the regulations actually encourage that.
Okay. Michaela, anything you'd add?
Nope, I think he covered it.
Julie, got it? All right. All right, everybody. We're at the end. I'm going to ask each of you to kind of give your closing final thoughts, what you'd like board members to know or leadership to know or staff to know or communities to know. What's your closing thoughts on mergers and acquisitions in the nonprofit sector?
I'm going to close with the same thing I said at the beginning, and that's remember your mission. This is all about your mission. If you have done what is necessary to continue your mission and your mission is still needed, you're doing the right thing. This isn't about organization preservation. It's about your mission.
Yeah, what Michaela said. My thing would be to change for executive directors and for boards both the mindset that we're here to keep this organization going, to change from that to we're here to pursue this mission in the way that most makes sense for the community.
Mine is in that same vein. I agree with both those things, and then talk about partnerships early and often with your board.
Michaela, Julie, Jacob, thank you for our very rich and practical conversation. As I've listened to our discussion, I keep returning to that phone call in 2016 and asking why, when the answer was we have to merge. And so what I hope our listeners take away from today's episode, first, examine all your options. Merger is one path, but so is joint venture. But there are lots of different ways to go about ensuring, as each of you have said today, the goal needs to be about continuing your mission and serving your community. And there's lots of different ways to do that. Don't let urgency narrow your thinking before you've mapped out the full landscape. Second, don't underestimate the human dimensions of these transitions and transactions. We spent a lot of time today talking about, kind of the due diligence side of things, the legal structures, regulatory components, all of which are essential. But each of you have identified that among the most challenging part of these transitions is, in fact, the human element, both inside and outside of the organization. So whether we're talking about disparate compensation structures, cultural differences, staff anxiety, these things don't disappear simply because leadership has chosen a joint venture over a merger. Regardless of what this is, there's work to be done. You have to actively, transparently, and intentionally address each of these issues and concerns throughout the process. Third, act from a position of strength, not crisis. The organizations I've worked with in North Carolina had 18 months of runway when we started. So they had plenty of money to go through this process because they were careful, they were intentional. They started working together months before they started working with me. And we worked together 18 months on one formation. So what I don't want folks to be put off by, because Jacob, to your point, mergers and acquisitions, whatever structure that looks like, is necessary and important in the nonprofit sector. So the point here is that to do these things and to do them well, you need to be intentional. Have those informal conversations, as Julie talked about, right from the beginning, as soon as possible. And then finally, know when to bring in expertise. These decisions involve legal, financial, operational complexity. They involve the psychology of people. So know to bring these in. Help your board members understand their fiduciary duties and that they need to have these outside counsels, independent financial analyses, whatever it is that might be. They're there to help and they can be tremendously beneficial. So to our listeners, if this episode resonates with you, I'd encourage you to share it with your board, your leadership team, or a colleague who might be wrestling with the same questions. And if you're in the middle of these decisions right now, I hope today's conversation gave you a clearer framework for thinking through what comes next. Thank you for joining us on the Atrómitos Way. Until next time.